back to the Kings. Welcome back to the Kingsway podcast.
Welcome back. We're glad you're here.
Yeah, this is a good day.
I'm stoked about
I feel it.
I really am.
I'm just gonna give an honest update. I'm very excited about this topic, but I'm afraid we're not gonna give it its due justice.
We're gonna give it a good old
college try. Yeah. Yeah.
No, I think the dynamics and the depth of what we're going to talk about, you're right. They are broad, and it is probably larger than we can cover in a 30-minute podcast. However, I hope we whet the appetite.
Yeah, I hope so too.
And this is part 2 too. So some people are coming into this and they're like ready for, the Avengers to assemble, Thanos to be defeated, and some sort of mystical utopian future to be
To be clear, last episode we put out was stories part 1, and we talked about some of our favorite Marvel stories. I thought of this later, this phrase that really tied it together, or this idea that tied it together. The reason we talked about Marvel stories is because, one, we enjoy them, but also because the strength and unity of a nation or any group is only as strong as their stories.
Yeah.
So when I was in Bible college for my undergrad, and I took a class called History of the Roman Empire, the guy who taught it, Dr. Shane Wood, who appears in every episode of our podcast, he framed the class not like years 500 to 400 BC. He framed it like, this is what you need to do to have a successful empire. And it's like these 7 things. And one was control the narrative. So their narrative was, we are conquerors, we are whatever. Even Remus and Romulus, the origin of Rome, had this narrative of like, we will fight and we will win. We are unstoppable. That kind of, we're the winning brother.
Yep.
Or something like that. And so they were always heavy on controlling the narrative. That's why all of their coinage, they had like, not graffiti, but like carved images on a bunch of stuff, on temples, on bridges, on whatever, that told the story of Rome doing what Rome does, the way they want you to know it.
Yep.
There was a time, I don't think it was the Maccabean revolt, but it might have been, where Rome defeated the Jews, one of the few times they did it, because they did it a bunch of times, and they put it on all their coins, on the back of all their coins. Like where you'd see George Washington's face, you would see Rome just like ripping the Jews a new one. And that was immortalized on their coins, so that as you're paying for stuff, you're looking at their propaganda, talking about how great we are, how even if it was true to some extent, controlling the story was powerful. So when I think about, I've watched some videos and been thinking about race stuff recently, and I've heard some more conservative people say like, I wish we could just go back to the 50s. Well, for African Americans, for women, the 50s were not the best time to be alive. They weren't necessarily the worst time, but like okay, their slavery was illegal. Cool. Also, that was like the time of Martin Luther King and the bus boycotts and all this stuff, and getting hit by fire hoses and dogs and whatever. Like, that was not a good time to be alive for African Americans. But I think the reason they think that is, number one, maybe their parents told it to them. That's the way they explained the story of where we came from. 2, we were getting off of the high of World War II. Yep. Which, that's a story. That Nazis are bad, Japanese are bad, Italians are bad, the Axis powers or whatever. And we're good. We're fighting evil. Yep. We're not fighting for safety. We're not fighting for oil in the Mideast. We're fighting for the cause of good and everything that the Lord is on, and they're all the devil and whatever. Yeah, is that true? Yeah. Were we innocent in that war? Heck no.
No.
Like,
we had our own moments.
We had Japanese internment camps in the United States, which I'm sure we put just any random East Asian people into, and not just Japanese, but like we weren't innocent either. It's a lot more complicated than that. But that's the story we were sold.
Well,
that
and
united
that propaganda. I mean, that's the truth of any empire. I mean, that's why Shane defined it that way. It's like controlling the narrative is part of it. We've experienced it over COVID. You know, it's like fighting to control the narrative, fighting to control what, and the people that push back. And that's why freedom of speech and like having the opportunity to talk about it is so important to
That's
people.
why it's in the Constitution. I think about this. Freedom of speech is in the Constitution next to the right to bear arms.
Yep.
Both are equally there to fight off a tyrannical government. Yep. Because, you may need to physically fight off a tyrannical government in their view, but also if the government controls the narrative, you're losing half the battle.
And that's part of why I think recognizing the power of stories is that narrative flows through everything.
Yeah.
And I mentioned it last time, the part 1, I should say. But there was an old preacher that used to use a way of talking about large numbers of people coming to know Christ and small numbers of people that come to know Christ. And the way that he would talk about it is every number has a name, every name has a story, and every story matters to God.
Yeah.
And he wasn't as talking about like story like propaganda. He was talking like story like the truth of who you really are.
Your actual experiences.
Your actual story. And I always thought that was powerful because I think if there's anything that I find is kind of a congruent negative feeling, especially in the time of social media and being a little disconnected over the last couple years, or even just coming out of high school, in family, out of family, you hear all the time, like, no one really knows who I really am. Like, no one really knows me.
Yeah.
And you hear that and you're like, obviously you feel like you know your story, but you don't feel like other people have been close enough to the truth of of what your story is to know who you really are.
Yeah. And part of that goes to you have the story inside you and you're living externally in a story. Mm-hmm. And so all that national propaganda we were talking about, that kind of stuff, what they're trying to do is, number 1, paint a picture of who they are. Number 2, have their story, have you agree with their story. Mm-hmm. So the reason you feel like an outcast is because you feel like your story doesn't match with the cultural story that is being presented to you. So
absolutely,
at the dawn of every innovation in media, so think the printing press, think the internet, think telephones. We've broken down further and further into different tribes because the stranglehold on the one narrative that unites a group has now been broken into whoever has a telephone, whoever has a news. So the printing press was part of why the Reformation took off. There had been other Reformations before, and the Catholic Church had squashed them, but in the 1500s, the printing press helped Martin Luther and John Calvin and Zwingli and some other people get pamphlets out to talk about what they thought about these different issues with the Catholic Church, and that helped people agree because this new medium was getting to them. So in the age of the internet and telephones and all that, we've been watching our culture, our country break down, and the world break down into further and further smaller tribal groups, tribalism. And this allows people to choose between more stories that their life agrees with or their life disagrees with.
Yeah.
So to bring it full circle, the reason we did the Marvel episode is because that is one of the few stories our country can overall agree on. We can't agree on were the 50s good or bad. We can't agree on some history stuff with different conspiracy theories. We can't agree on most basic facts, but we can agree on the fact that Doctor Strange is great.
Yeah.
Like that's one of the few things we can all get behind, because if you love TV from the 60s, 70s, 80s, and you try to tell somebody about an episode now, either they haven't seen it or they think that most of it's offensive now or whatever, not judging any of that, but saying like, we've divided so minutely. That's one of the few places we can generally agree.
Well, and those Marvel movies have become kind of a staple for a time period, a generation.
Yeah.
You know, I think back to what sports was kind of that earlier on in my life, where like as long as whoever I was around liked baseball, like cool. My story included baseball. Their story included baseball. And even the things we disagreed with, like they were Yankees fans and I was Diamondbacks fans, we would push through that because of the love of baseball as a whole. And that's what held things together. I think what's so fun about I think the depth of this discussion is not necessarily trying to sell you, as we kind of have been over the last few minutes, of why, this discussion is worth having, but also point out that whether or not you believe in this, you're a part of this narrative.
Yeah.
Like, you have been influenced, you have chosen to relate. How you live has in part, in either a large way, small ways, or minute, direct or indirect ways, been influenced by propaganda, narrative, sports, movies, culture. We would just say it like the world, and that's how the Bible would describe it, right? Like the world's influence on you. And I was always thought that was like a scary, crazy thing. And now I'm like, nah, I mean, sometimes I just like Subway because they're a foot long and you get thin when you eat Subway sandwiches. And now I look back and I'm like, and I was like, milk. You got to drink lots of milk because milk makes your bones strong.
And then you're like 400 pounds. You're like, what happened?
Wait, I'm like, calcium makes your bones strong, not milk.
Yeah.
Milk just has some calcium in it. So, those types of things have been around for a long time, and they're not all governmental. Sometimes they're family oriented. Sometimes it's a narrative your mom or your dad or your uncle or friends placed on or were highly influential on you, and then you didn't match up or you didn't line up, or heaven forbid you disagree with like that narrative. It's incredible how many of the Marvel stories start that way, with just like a narrative that one of the characters just chooses not to trust, believe, or be a part of.
Yeah. The important thing that makes a story good, and this is such an overgeneralization, but the important thing that makes a story good is relatability. I like Doctor Strange. Am I a sorcerer? No. Like, have I been to other dimensions? I don't think so. Last time I checked them, it's still in the same dimension I was born in. All those things. But what did I relate to in those? Well, conflict in general I related to. What I relate to is the end of the movie, which I'm not going to spoil, which plays on family relationships, and that's all I want to say. I don't want to spoil it, but it plays on like family closeness and relationships, and that's why the story mattered. Not because one guy practiced necromancy and raised a guy from the dead to go attack another. Like, I've never been a part of that. But I have been a part of, like, you need to do something drastic to hold together what you think is important in this situation.
That's exactly why I like Captain America as one of my favorite characters, because Captain America's character, the serum that's inside of him, amplifies his will. It amplifies what his greatest desires. So his characteristics, what he hopes will happen, his optimism, his kindness, his heart, but also his will for justice and his will for teamwork. And it amplifies everything inside of him to the level that it only is limited by his ability for the will to be strong enough, not his body, not his mind, but literally the innermost part of him is drastically exploded into something stronger, better, bigger, more wanted. And anytime I listen to a story, I'm like, well, of course it's Captain America, so of course that in itself has like a whole narrative behind it. You know what I mean? You're like, I see what they're doing with their. I don't know if it's all about that, but originally when the character was written, that's exactly what it was. That's the concept of what it was. But I just feel myself in that I have optimism and I have a desire that if I will it and I want it bad enough, and it's good for me or for others, that why not? Why can't we make this happen? Why can't we go after it? Why shouldn't it be something we aim for? And so when I watch that character, just in me just goes like, that's, and he's also comes from a super conservative home, which was part of my, upbringing. And so one of the first movies is like, language. And they're all just like, did Cap just say language? Like, sorry, old habits die hard. And I'm like, that's his heart. His will is for the benefit of all. So here's the curious thing about this conversation, because I think this is a beautiful setup, but I want to transition this into why this doesn't just, I think, also hit into human nature. And I think it translates so well into like what we see around us and how we experience it as individuals. But I also think it hits to how we were created to be. Like what we were designed to be inspired by, designed to model and to be a part of. One of my favorite things about the Bible Project is even the way they set their whole study up.
Yeah.
Where the Bible is a collections of stories that all speak about the story that is of God. And they recognize the power that what we're talking about really has. But you brought up this book, and I love that you have it here. And I think this is what I want to transition to for the rest of our time, at least for the most part.
At the very end, I have a few other books, and I'm going to talk about them for a second. But I'm on my second time reading this book called Telling the Truth by Frederick Buechner, Buechner. And it's about story. He was an American theologian. Maybe he's still alive. But he at least was, maybe is, an American theologian and storyteller. And I bought this book because some podcast is talking about story, and I bought it like 4 years ago, and I can't find that podcast anymore. But the whole premise of the book is that he's this masterful writer going in between prose discourse, just like telling you stuff, and narrative, where he's painting these awesome pictures of scenes of people struggling and uses that as examples of whatever. But the reason it's called Telling the Truth is because he's saying that all good stories, and he's talking to Christians in here as well as everybody else, so all good preaching tells the truth, not part of the truth.
Mm-hmm.
So is it true that John 3:16 is for God to love the world? Yes. But the truth, which encompasses all things, is like your story and God's story put together or something like that. And he's like, it's like talking about being truthful. I think a lot of 90s, 2000s kids, 90s kids at least, would say that what they really want out of the world is authenticity more than security. I feel like that's a common denominator for boomers and builders and people from that generation, 60s, 70s, 80s, security. But what people from the 90s want is authenticity. And this book is almost talking exactly about that. He gives the story of some lecturer at Yale and how he's about an hour before his lecture, and he doesn't know what he's going to talk about.
Oh, gosh.
And if you've never gone to school, maybe you don't know what that feels like. But if you live in America, you had to go to like 8, 10, 12, whatever years of it. And that's such a relatable feeling. But he talks about how he had this epiphany from God and whatever. And he goes in there and he talks about it. And then he starts talking about everybody else in that room when he starts speaking. And he's not at Yale to lecture to an outside world. He's at Yale to lecture to a bunch of inside worlds. He says the preaching to the world that people live in is one way to do it. It's kind of a weak or okay way to do it. But the best way to preach is to preach to the world that lives in them. Because when they pack their suitcases, they outside of themselves bring socks and shirts and whatever. And inside of themselves, they bring their love for their mom. And they bring their dislike for the feeling of a chalkboard. And they bring their everything about their experience and their story and their what they prioritize, what they love, what they hate. It's what they're bringing with them. And preaching to that part of a person is so much more impactful. I think it's one of the reasons why C.S. Lewis talked about, not in these words exactly, but sharing your testimony is one of the most powerful apologetics, which is like defense of the faith, things you can do more than the cosmological argument, more than whatever, saying God did this in my life when I was struggling with this.
It's hard to disprove that.
Yeah.
How do you disprove that?
But it's not even about the evidence. It's about the reality that God doesn't live only in the outside world. He longs to live in the world that lives in you.
You're forced to sit with it. I guess that's what I mean, where like you can dissolve some other issues with science or I'm not against science in any way, shape, or form. It's just more of like when a mom tells a story about how much she loves her kid. You can't disprove that that's the amount of love she has or less. Like it's very hard to do. Like you're like, oh, she really does love her child. It's like, and it's the same when you talk about that. That's powerful.
Yeah.
I know for me, one of the gripping things as you're kind of opening and talking about this, the truth of this, this idea of telling the truth, but also recognizing that the full truth is what requires of the gospel. And when we were talking about this, of course, I preach almost every week. Thank goodness since you've been here, I've had a few more weeks off. And one of the things that I have been thinking about since you mentioned is that idea of like talking to generalities versus talking to individuals. So talking to the luggage store rather than talking to the person's personal luggage. You know, it's like talking to the things that could fit in the suitcase versus the things that are actually in their suitcase. And I think the gospel is a beautiful story of Jesus exactly doing that. Almost, I cannot think of a single example right now where Jesus interacts with a person in the Gospels. And either the gospel writer himself outs himself and admits that this is where everybody's coming from, or talks about it explicitly, like a Luke, where he like admits to where this person is, or like a Matthew that like gives tax collectors their own category of sin because he recognizes like they're pretty low in the social totem pole. And Jesus never talks in them as generalities. He always talks to them as individuals.
Yeah.
He's almost always interacting with the woman at the well as like not a Samaritan woman, but as this woman who's been married 5 times, who God knows and sees. The Chosen even goes further on that episode where, you know, the details of that conversation, which I do not think are beyond explosion. You know, the Zacchaeus, I think of Matthew, I think of anybody in the New Testament. He's so individualistic in his approach to the gospel.
Yeah.
Like he legitimately is not trying to say like, you know, if you followed me, all the good things, you know, it's like, no, like you know, those who, so I don't know. It's a really neat way to think about the power of narrative.
Jesus does address people individualistically, but when he preaches so many times, he says the kingdom of God, which is, I mean, it's still specifically the kingdom of God, but it's this, like Jesus is doing 2 things. One, he's preaching to the world inside you.
Yep.
You are not irrelevant in the conversation about the world and princes and principalities and powers and whatever. But at the same time, just like Shane was talking about with building an empire and propaganda and whatever, propaganda not as a bad thing, but as you trying to paint a worldview, to put it one way. He's preaching about the kingdom of God, not as this thing that is outside of yourself. I don't like the way I said that. He's preaching about the kingdom of God as something that you can join.
Yes.
This can become your story. In the same way that fighting the Nazis became every American story, even if you're staying at home because of medical conditions and working in a factory or something, like it is all your story. You're all on board with that. He's not saying one of these stories matters and one doesn't, but that your story matters. You matter. And I'd love for you to be a part of this story. That's why, to get theological for a second, why I think some Calvinists have it weird or wrong, because they want to say salvation is individualistic and can you lose your salvation? Can you whatever? And that makes sense if salvation is a name tag on every person.
Yeah.
But for other Christians, salvation is a boat. Salvation is the church, and not the 503c whatever organization. Not just am I within the 4 walls at the right time at the right part of the week when everything gets accounted for, but like God's true worldwide across time church full of people who are actually following him. That is who is saved because they've stepped into the church as a communal thing.
All I've been thinking about is like Jesus does this beautiful job of positive, incredibly heaven, you know, I would call it like utopian vision of what the kingdom of God is going to look like, right?
Yeah.
But the people that he invites into that and the people that he longs to see and say will be a part of it, the individuals that he speaks to, especially like the Beatitudes or anywhere in the Sermon on the Mount, they're always coming from a place of he recognizes the tragedy. And I don't want to transition too quickly into that, but the gripping thought that as we painted this idea of unfolding the full truth, which is God's truth and your truth, intersecting, that is the beauty of the gospel. And that is because of this concept of tragedy that sits at the center of all our lives. And I love what you told me yesterday when we were talking about this, thinking about this ahead of time. And it's the concept that that every life, no matter how well lived, no matter how well loved, either out or in, no matter how much wealth, no matter where you were born geographically, no matter how healthy you were, no matter how much you ate or little you had, every life ends in death, which is tragedy.
Yeah.
No life escapes the tragedy.
Even the New Testament talks a lot about this, but they never say in the New Testament, you don't die. What they do say is that you don't stay dead.
Yep.
But every life ends in death, except for maybe when Jesus comes back, if you want to be real technical.
Well, some he says some will sleep. You know what I mean?
Well, I'm thinking, is it 1 Thessalonians 3 or 4? The dead in Christ will rise first. Like if you're still alive when he shows back up. But that's like a technicality. Every life ends in death, no matter how well lived, no matter how poorly lived.
Yeah.
Death is a major stop, if not the last stop. Actually, I guess it's not the last stop for anybody if we all rise for judgment and then whatever. Anyway, but so the full title of this book is Telling the Truth, the Gospel as Tragedy, Comedy, and Fairy Tale. And if that name scares you, let me give some definitions for what that is.
Yeah, because sometimes English terms can be a little deceitful.
I don't remember how ancient this is, if it's just Shakespearean, but I think it's like ancient Greek or Roman or something, at least. So a tragedy, I think it's Greek. A tragedy is a story that starts off good and continually goes downhill and ends in the pit, ends in despair. A comedy is not necessarily funny, but it's a story that starts off low. This person is in the pit. And through the course of the story, they're rising and rising, and things are being solved and getting happier, and they end in a good place. Think a romantic comedy where if you take out the comedy funny part, it's usually like, this guy works at a print shop. Oh, there's ink on his face. And by the end, he's like, in 90 minutes, he's married this person and they're going off into the sunset. That's a Greek comedy, an ancient comedy. And that's what he's talking about. It's a tragedy and it's a comedy. And then fairy tale is not meaning it's untrue, but it means two things particularly. We were just listening to the video of him explain this.
The author. I love it.
One is that there are things bigger than ourselves in the story, mystical, supernatural things that exist. Now, for us, they actually exist in the real world, but at least for the purpose of the story, they do exist. And secondly, what was the other thing?
They're revealed.
Yeah, everyone's revealed to be who they really are.
Yep.
He says the frog turns into the prince. The beautiful woman is revealed to be a witch all along. Yep. That everybody's masks fall off.
Yeah.
That's the fairy tale part.
I love that concept. And then he uses a CS quote to talk about like there's a word that we think of it like it's a calamity. But there's actually, and I cannot remember.
Eucatastrophe.
Which I love that idea, which is the positive side. Like this moment of revealing that is amazing or awesome. And fairy tales have both. Fairy tales have both.
Yeah.
So that's kind of a cool concept.
Think about how old Baptist preachers would preach the gospel. They're modernists enough and would leave out a little bit of the hocus pocusy kind of part, the power bigger than yourself part. But it's always, you're a sinner, you're going down, but accept Jesus and you're not. And that's kind of in such short words, the swings of what he's doing with the tragedy and the comedy. The tragedy is that no matter how well you clothe yourself, you're just naked under your clothing. No matter how busy you fill your life, your life gets because of what you filled it with, there's this silence that you're afraid of to sit with yourself. And he talks about how authenticity and being real about story is, it's a line from King Lear, the Shakespeare play. At the end, I don't want to spoil it, but it's been out for 500 years. So if you haven't seen it, it's not my fault.
Darn, just missed
this
it.
one guy is left in the whole story, and he's like tiptoeing over piles of bodies. And this is the last line of the play. The weight of this sad time we must obey. Speak what we feel, not what we ought to say. It reminds me of, I was listening to a YouTuber who used to be a chaplain at a children's hospital. And he also writes some books, and he was griping that people were getting upset at his books for how obscene they were. A high schooler drinking and somebody having premarital sex. He said, I saw things in that children's hospital that were obscene. Children suffering. Why are you not as bothered by that as you are by cuss words, as you are by whatever? Because he's trying to paint this truth, this real life. Yeah. And I told this quote to you and you said you had heard it somewhere else, that one of the best pieces of advice he got as a chaplain is don't just do something, stand there. Mm-hmm. Which is like, oof. Like you want to come out with parts of the truth. Hey, if this works this way, the formula parts. If you just do this, then you'll be happier and it gets easier every day. So don't worry about it and whatever.
Well,
but the whole truth is that person died.
Yeah.
You're in trying to solve it. You're actually leaving out other parts of the truth.
Yep. And I was just going to say, that's John 15, abide, when Jesus says, abide in me.
Yeah.
It's not a Bible verse. It's a presence. It's the promise of a presence. Rob Bell, before his major shift in theology, put out these Pneuma videos.
Yeah, I remember
the Pneuma videos.
Yeah.
Some of you that grew up in the church, you're like, yeah,
they're the best. They're teenage Veggie Tales almost.
But he talked about the Jewish culture thing of Shiva, sitting Shiva with somebody. And that's where they actually hired somebody when someone was in mourning. That was their whole job.
Yeah,
was just to come and sit with you.
Yeah.
And if you cried, they would cry. And if they laughed, they would laugh with you.
Yeah.
And that was what a true friend was supposed to do, was come and sit Shiva. And I've thought about that for 20 years now.
Yeah.
But it's funny that you say that, because I'm like, that's exactly what the whole truth is, and why a good chaplain knows that, because it's like that's all you have to offer. One of the things as this plays out, and I obviously haven't read the book, Ryan's been diving through it, we've been discussing it, but these terms stick with me. I just think about how, as I preach every week, all three of these things come through my mind. I just didn't realize these terms.
Yeah.
It's like I sit with a crowd of people every Sunday that I know will die. I sit with a crowd of people, though, that are improving their life, their marriages, their families. They're making choices that are sanctifying their souls, and I'm seeing the love of God come out of them and the fruits of Spirit be brought out in their life like a comedy.
Yeah.
Where they're not what they once were. But I also know there is a day, maybe in my lifetime, where the great revealing will happen. And sometimes it's not at the very end when Jesus comes back. Sometimes it's a quick moment where you see the truth. Sometimes it's a revealing in a hardness or a hard time. Sometimes it's a revealing of a great joy or victory or prayer. But there are fairy tale moments.
Yeah.
In the best and worst of ways, when you preach, when you teach, when you're around this community of people. And the gospel doesn't ignore any of those things.
Yeah.
It doesn't. It just doesn't ignore any of those things. And I find it so incredibly fascinating and compelling. What Marvel movie doesn't fit that?
Yeah.
We're watching. You can see my eyeballs staring at your soul. If you're listening, I hope you hear my eyeballs staring at your soul. What common modern story, even something you fell in love with even earlier, maybe even yesterday if you want to, like, what stories don't pull on these heartstrings?
You're totally right that so I remember this from a Creative Arts Academy camp, something that Ozark Christian College does, and I love it to death. But we had Doug Welch speak for one of those weeks, and he was talking about story, which that's going to be good because I love him to death. I don't know him super well personally, but I listened to the Every Thought Captive podcast with some of the professors from there talking, and he's always the guy. They're like, "What's your favorite movie?" "Oh, it's this and this," and he's like, "This Norwegian film from the 80s and whatever." And you're just like, nobody knows what that is.
I just remember everybody loved The Greatest Showman, and he loved La La Land, and I remember I was like, I love La La Land.
Yeah. He's just like the artsy guy of the three of them, the most artsy. But he was, I think it was him, maybe it was Mark Scott, but I think it was him talking. And he said that every good story is good because it borrows from the gospel.
Ooh.
Every good story is good because the tragic parts of it are the tragic parts acknowledged in the gospel. You want it to either be hope or despair, and really it's both simultaneously. So you despair and you're like, is anybody good in this world? Well, what you're really saying is Romans 3:23 and the beginning of 6:23 and some of these other passages
fall short of the glory of God.
Yep. Yeah. And when you want to talk about hope, you talk about hope, but what you're really wanting to say and what you really hope you could say. 1 Corinthians 15, the last enemy to be defeated shall be death. You want to say Isaiah 25 and Revelation 21.
Shout out
yes,
Harry
Potter. Thank you.
That's on the gravestone of Harry's parents, by the way.
Yeah.
Just throwing that out there.
We'll get back to that in a second. I want to talk about that more, but that's why you talk about every tear will be wiped away from their eye. If that's not a true Greek comedy, I mean, it's not pulling from that only, but like, because Isaiah was way before that, but like,
they know where to
power.
Pull. They know where to pull that from, man, because it's had deep impact.
And then the fairy tale part. I mean, you talk about both of those.
Yeah,
who can overcome our inability to be anything other than merely animals?
Dude, I think about Endgame when he's like Avengers Assemble, and all of a sudden he's like there by himself. The tragedy of what's about to happen, everything's gonna fall apart. It felt like everything was getting better. And then the portals appear. What was unseen.
Yeah, the fairy tale part.
The fairy show rescues. You know, it's so cool, man. I love that concept that every great story borrows from the gospel. Or is bound to or begins through a truth of the gospel. That to me, I am hard pressed in my mind to not think about how it all connects. Now, for some of you, this isn't like as convincing as more like, so we've all bought into the propaganda of the gospel, and it's intertwined into everything that we do. And to me, I don't see it that way. I see it as a deep longing of the soul that is confirmed throughout millennia of the connection to it.
Yeah.
Like baseball of the universe.
Yeah.
I
think about like Genesis 1-3 and whatever. And do I relate to walking with and seeing God with my own two eyes? No. Do I relate to talking to a snake and it talking back to me? No. Do I relate to pointing fingers at somebody?
I mean, it's always crazy that the biblical characters like you're drawing out. Like, I love how there's parts of the story that are very specific and obviously are more difficult to relate to, like the paradise of the garden. But versus the subject matter or the actual dynamics of the story are very comparable. That's why Shakespeare, even though it's written, hundreds, it's still very relatable. And one of my favorite movies from the 90s, 10 Things I Hate About You, is a re-representation of The Taming of the Shrew. Yeah. And it's one of my favorite movies because it relates to a story that related to hundreds, if not thousands of people's hundreds of years ago. Like, I mean, the story carries over. Yeah. And I think that's what the power of recognizing that the gospel has had deep positive propaganda demonstrations.
Yeah.
Deep.
It's I feel the same way about propaganda talking about the gospel as I do about manipulation talking about worship ministry. There's an obvious way it's been mishandled.
Yeah.
Manipulation, you think like a weirdly manipulative like boyfriend or girlfriend.
11 o'clock at night.
But also think about a potter. Like they're just manipulating clay, which is neutral.
Yeah, it started out a square. How dare you make it a pot?
Yeah, how dare you make it useful and functional and maybe beautiful and whatever. I think about propaganda the same way. I don't trust propaganda to be used by anyone in a good way. But I trust God to use propaganda well, to use story well, to use those things to let his already compelling gospel be told in a compelling way.
And if propaganda is without concrete evidence, or if it does not back up, I think propaganda stands on its own. We're watching that, maybe a hot take with Russia. But at the same time, that there are things that can be propaganda for, like you mentioned in the 50s, of recognizing that human beings all have value in the sight of God and that our own Constitution declared that. Yeah. And propaganding for that was nothing short of what God would have wanted. And so, having some of this stuff, it does get, like you said, it gets hijacked. It gets this negative connotation with it. I think God, Genesis 1-3 is absolutely universal propaganda to the brokenness of the human story.
Yeah.
That's what it is. Hey, here's how it was supposed to be. Here's what we did. You still feel it. I still feel it. And it's had major consequence.
Yeah.
That's the tragedy.
I'm sad that we have to wrap this up, but we do. So I want to very quickly go over some of these books as ways for you to dig further into this. First of all, Telling the Truth by Frederick Buechner. It's like 97 pages. please.
Yes.
Please read this. It's so good. It's not just prose narrative or prose discourse. He's not just telling you why story is important. He's using stories that feel like books I would have had to read for high school English that I secretly liked, but didn't like starting to read, just liked reading once I was reading it.
Ender's
So
Game.
good. It was published in the 70s, and it's still so relatable. So that it talks about the gospel in general in these big sweeping movements, but it's really good. Also, The Storytelling Church by Jeff Barker, if you want a bigger book that goes into more details, maybe a little bit about how church leadership can use this or being a church member can whatever, but it goes a little more specifically into the church and storytelling, including chapters, a bunch of them on like story in general, but also talking about relationships and storytelling, talking about like humility and worship leadership, and anyway, talking about how worship's supposed to know your whole story. This is a good book. Then the last two I have are both the Bible turned into story.
Ooh.
So I'm going to show you the more common one first. It's called The Story. It's a like NIV 400 or 500 page narrative telling of the whole Bible. So it's like 31 chapters, but it's the Bible. But it looks like a book. It's like written like a book. It's one column like books are. Other than the Bible, it's got a few little pictures in there, but the rest of it is like telling the gospel story, the Bible story, as one continuous front to back chronological story. So if you've ever thought to yourself, I've been reading the Bible, but I don't understand how any of this fits together, this is for you. If you want a shorter, more story told rather than quoted version, this is one of my favorites. Please buy this. The Story of God, The Story of Us by Sean Gladding, Sean, Sean. This is like an 8 chapter, maybe. Yeah, like an 8-ish, maybe 12. 12 chapter, bigger movement, narrative telling of the Bible. But each narrative telling is a narrative. So early on, you're around the campfire, some ancient tribe, and a guy's telling you the story around the campfire. So you're like 2 layers deep on the story. It's so compelling, so good, very biblically faithful. And if you read this and then go back and read the Bible itself, you will understand where the pieces fit better. This is, I think, even if you're going to read the story, the bigger 400 or 500 page book, I would get The Story of God, The Story of Us first, read that, and then go back and read the story for a little bit more specificity, more quotation.
I feel like
than
this could be the linchpin episode for somebody to truly see themselves, not just as somebody that attends a church or believes in a guy named Jesus because his grandma took him to church, or he just grew up in it. He's been bringing his kids, or some of the ladies out there. I guarantee you, listen, you've just been scared to tell your mom that you weren't going to church, so you came to church, but you never found yourself in this story that we've been talking about this whole time. You've heard about it, you felt it at times, but it felt more maybe like manipulation or propaganda. I'm telling you.
Or it felt far away, like a fairy tale.
It is not. It is absolutely at the core of every human being's story. That it is attached to a larger narrative, and that narrative has central themes that run through even our media. They run through each family, each country. They run through each racial group, economic group, and we are all deeply connected through tragedy. And we all have equal opportunity to see God work an incredible good work, just like a comedy, and ultimately reveal his power to change and make things new. So, hey, thank you so much for paying attention. And if you've listened this long, gold star. Leave us a review, hit the like button, share it with somebody that you think might be helpful. Share both parts, because I think the first is obviously a connection to modern day versions of this, but the second half obviously is where we think the meat and bones are.
I think I'm just throwing this out here first time. We could do a short, medium, third episode on story, talking about how the church uses story today. The different Jewish festivals throughout the year.
I don't think that would be a bad idea at all.
I think we should.
We're going to probably do a third episode.
I was thinking about it, and I meant to mention it this time.
I like the idea of picking that back up. I hope today was helpful. It was very encouraging and helpful for me. And Ryan, thanks for taking the time to read some of this, share your wisdom and knowledge, and happy to be a part of it.
Yeah.
And we'll continue the conversation in another week.
Yeah.
Have a great and glorious day of the Lord. See you later.
See ya.